Okay, so we just got done talking about why we should collaborate. Now we're going to talk about how we should collaborate, collaboration in practice. And I want to be specific here that I am now going to talk more about macro collaboration versus micro collaboration. What I mean by that is we kind of dealt with a lot of the micro in the last session, which is when you go for consultation in one direction for another, when you look for training in one direction for another. I want to talk about what it looks like for these different sectors to collaborate around certain community level needs. Think issues like mental health crisis, suicide, homelessness, food insecurity. What does it look like to collaborate community-wide across sectors for issues like this? It funnels down to the micro, but I want to first talk about that macro piece in much of what I'm going to be saying in this session. Access services, in the example that I'm going to be giving, I've already talked about it, I'm part of Access Services, and so we have been doing work. Access has a housing and homeless division, and Intersect has been collaborating with them in order to address homelessness. I recognize we're at a church in mental health, not a church and homelessness summit. But two things on that. One, the principles I'm going to be talking about apply regardless of what the community level issue is. So that's one thing. And second, what I've found is being at the intersection of faith and mental health, you oftentimes find that you're sometimes also at the intersection of faith and intellectual disabilities, and faith and substance use, or faith and homelessness. Not because everybody in one camp is also in another camp, but sometimes people have co-occurring experiences. And so this is why I'm going to talk out of our experience with this homelessness issue. But a lot of the people that we served were also dealing with mental health struggles, because sometimes mental health struggles can lead you to a place where you might be struggling with housing, or dealing with homelessness can sometimes not really be helpful to your mental wellness. And so just know that that's how I'm kind of coming at some of this as we connected with them. What I'm going to be sharing with you comes out of a particular exercise that was funded by SAMHSA. This is the picture of a manual that we have for a 8-week training series. If any of you are interested in it for your church or organization, let me know. It's a grant funded by SAMHSA saying, hey, let's look at what it looks like to collaborate across sectors, and then what your findings are and how you can equip others to do that work. So that's where this is coming from. I'm going to take 8 weeks and put it into a half an hour and 45 minutes. So you're just going to get a lot of just different little nuggets thrown at you and a chance to process some of it. In addition to, so let me just say a quick word on that too, what happened. During the pandemic, a lot of shelters and a lot of housing services started closing down, both because of their desire to make sure they were being safe, and also just because there was lack of volunteers for some of these things. And so what we realized was we needed more help to deal with some of the gaps in homeless and care for people who are homeless. And so we got together and started bringing people together from faith communities, bringing people together from human services, bringing people together from government. And we meet every Friday morning. We call them frequent Friday meetings, and we talk about the work being done. And I would just take notes of some of the things that we were learning. And then we would take those notes and say, what are the principles we can take from that? And so that's the principles you're hearing come from that weekly exercise during the pandemic, as we were trying to mobilize the church and providers and government to collaborate for the common good of those who were living outside during that time. Another collaborative space we've been in is what's called Answering the Call. This is another grant-funded collaborative exercise where we have been mobilizing churches, mobilizing faith communities to say, not just in the pandemic, but like ongoing, what are creative solutions you have to be able to respond to homelessness? And so tomorrow actually is our final session. And then basically what we've been doing in this series is we've been equipping them to be able to learn about homelessness. And now in this final session, we're looking at the church saying, okay, church, what ideas have you been having? What are things, I love the statement about, Love Inc. looking at like what different churches have. That's where we're at right now in our work. I'm saying all this to say, insights are coming from these collaborations. We sometimes refer to ourselves at Intersect as a teaching hospital, which is to say, like a teaching hospital, we're kind of learning by doing. We partner with researchers and academics who do top-down, like, wow, that's a beautiful model. I wonder if we can use that. We're more like, what's working as we do stuff? And then what principles rise to the surface that we can share with others? A lot of background and context, but Trent told me I had 15 minutes to try to get rid of. So, I'm helping out Trent a little bit. All right. Now, before we get into some of those insights, some of you may think I'm not sure I like being in this space. Maybe some of you at your tables talked about how do you even collaborate with people really different than you? And when the government came to us saying to us hey, all these pastors are asking about local resources. What do we do? How do we help them? That was the beginning of what was called the Montgomery County Multi-Faith Coalition. Multi-faith is different than interfaith. I'm not critiquing interfaith, but some people from the faith community don't love entering interfaith spaces because it feels like you're asking them to leave their faith at the door and sing kumbaya with one another. And so the Multi-Faith Coalition, this language of multi-faith, is meant to say, come with your faith. Whoever you are, whether you're a person of faith, whether you're not, come as you are into this space and be that person. So these are some principles that undergird this coalition that I'm hoping could be helpful to you as you think about how you might do collaborative work moving forward. First, it's what I've just been saying. Bring your whole self to the conversation. If you're a Christian, then when you enter these spaces, stay a Christian. Talk like a Christian. Think like a Christian. You're bringing that background. You're bringing those insights. It's who you are, and respect other people who don't have the same perspective that you do. Which brings us to the second. Respect is different than agreement. We don't have to agree with one another in order to respect one another. When you're doing collaborative work, you are not going to agree with everybody you collaborate with. I don't agree with everybody in my family. I don't agree with everybody in my marriage, and I'm only married to one person. So nor does she agree with me, and so all the time. But the point is, we don't in any other space think we have to agree all the time. And so if there's places where you can't be involved because of your convictions, then you shouldn't be involved. I never want people to be involved in something where they feel like their convictions or their faith is being compromised. But there are ways of saying, this is how I can be involved, and I'm going to respect other people made in God's image, even if I don't always agree with them. Third, I mentioned this one in the earlier session. Sharing is different than imposition. People get concerned, well, what if I go into these things and people are going to try to be, proselytizing each other? People can share why they come to this exercise without necessarily saying, you have to be exactly like me. I remember we had a collaborative gathering in our area, and we were asking people, what brought you to this? And one of the people was not a person of faith, and she said, I just really want to be able to help this community flourish. There was a Jewish person there, and she said, I believe all people are made in God's image and have inherent value. That's what brings me here. There's a Christian pastor who said, it's Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It's the gospel that inspires me to be about this work. Each of them came saying, this is what's bringing me, and we weren't asking them to say, don't say that. Don't use those words. That's who you are. When you come into this space, bring who you are. And as you do that, collaborate for the common good. This is for the good of the whole community because it's a community level issue. And finally, and a person shared this in the back earlier, like this work is meant to be a win-win. It's meant to benefit. When the church does this work, it benefits the church. When providers do this work, it benefits their mission. When the government does this, it benefits their mission. If it's not a win-win, there's a problem. Seek to say, how do we collaborate in ways that actually each of our own missions are enhanced through collaboration? So 3 essential approaches I want to look at of putting collaboration into practice. First, identify community gaps and existing assets. Second, engage partners across sectors without duplication or burnout. And third, take a clear, context-specific next step toward collaboration. That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking through. First, identify community gaps and existing assets. We'll start first with the gaps. If it's a community's problem, make it a community's solution. More and more, we're recognizing that there are problems that are not just social service problems, they're not just church problems, they're not just government problems, they're really community problems. Homelessness is one of those. It impacts the business community. It impacts families. Somebody that we're walking with right now is a church who's a mom with a single mom, and she just lost her job. She's facing impending homelessness. That impacts her, and it impacts our church who's called to care for her. So therefore, when you're doing this collaborative work, it's not even just thinking about how do we bring together the faith community, the provider community, government. It's how do we bring the whole community together, because a particular issue is impacting that whole community. And what I want you to do as we're talking through this is maybe be thinking, what is that issue that you're passionate about, that you think is impacting this community, that you'd want to come together around? Next, start with the why. So not the why of collaboration, but the why of why do I want to collaborate? Not even just why should I, but why do I want to? What Simon Sinek kind of has a whole book on this, but this idea is just, you need to have this clarity, because if you're going to bring other people together, and if you're going to be someone who's tapping people on the shoulder and say, hey, let's collaborate around this issue, you need to be really clear on the why in your own mind. And we, during the pandemic, need to be really clear as we went to different people. This is why we're asking for your voice at the table, because this issue is impacting our whole community, and we need your help. You have to be clear on the why if you're going to do the how and the what of collaboration. But also identify existing assets, not just gaps, which is seeing what are the gaps that are out there for the community. What are the gaps leading you to say why you should be doing this work? But also not just the negative of finding those gaps, but also identify what are the existing assets in my community. If I do the difficult work of saying, wow, there's a real gap here, we need to be paying attention to this, I need to know what assets in my community might be able to fill that gap. But how do you identify the gap, the assets? Where do you go for that? One thing we need to do is go hyper-local. What do I mean by this? Do you ever feel like you're watching the news and wondering, how on earth can I do this collaborative work? I mean, when I watch the news, I just can't stand those people. And I think they wouldn't be able to stand me. And when we watch national news coverage, we think this is impossible. But I have found that people who I really disagree with on high level issues, when I rub shoulders with them in the community, I'm like, oh, they're actually like a human. And I've had people say to me, oh man, these Christians are blah, blah, blah. And I'll go, oh yeah, like I'm actually a Christian. And they have this look like, how is that possible? I've known you all these years, and I don't think you're stupid or a jerk, and yet somehow you're telling me you're a Christian. And so when we go hyper-local, when we get to know people in our own community, we find that collaboration is more possible than we realized. And we start realizing there's assets out there beyond just the people I know in my own church. I want to bring my church into this space to fill these gaps. But there's more assets out there than we even realize. And some of this is just doing the hard work of networking. I'm so glad these tables are here right now, because these are examples of assets in your community. People who you might go, I want to address this gap in my county, this community level issue. And now I realize one of those people I met at a table, they should be at the table. They should be one of those people talking. And so some of the time, and I would encourage you and your organizations or in your churches to give time to just network and get to know people so that you can determine what are the assets in my community. You have to slow down in order to speed up. If you're going to do that work of collaboration, slowing down to get to know where the assets are. And there are different asset maps that are out there. I've got one that a colleague often sends to people, so you could always email me if you want to have that asset mapping tool that can be used in finding out your local assets. But one of the things you want to do is just go hyperlocal, get to know people in your local community who you think are probably impacted by this, and go into different spaces and gatherings where people get together. Maybe it's head into your chamber of commerce. Maybe it's a local community collaborative. Maybe it's the Faith and Church and Mental Health Summit. There's a lot of spaces out there where if you just show up and start talking about the gap you're seeing, you'll start to learn there's a lot of assets out there we don't even realize. And stay proximate. In doing this work, you want to stay proximate to the people who are actually being impacted by it, because their voice needs to shape the work that you do. I have a colleague of mine, I'll mention him later. It's one of the tools he offers. His name is Mark Borse. Mark Borse goes to 2 churches on Sundays. He calls it the Church Under the Bridge, where he goes and hangs out with homeless people before he goes to his own church, Salford Mennonite Church, because he's trying to stay proximate with people who are living outside, so he hears from them what their actual needs are, so that we're responding to the real needs, not just our vision for what the needs are. So if we're going to identify the gaps and the assets, we need to stay informed as what's the person actually need, so that I can find the assets that can help them. Sometimes churches, I say this as a person who loves the church, sometimes we can be tempted to do the thing that is either most convenient or that we can just kind of wash our hands of. Like, I'm going to do this Saturday event, and this Saturday event will be able to feed those who are hungry, and we're going to invite the whole community to it. But I haven't actually talked to anyone who's hungry to find out, would a Saturday event at our church, which doesn't have access to public transportation, actually be helpful to you? How do we instead stay proximate enough so that we're finding what are the needs, so that we know what assets can best respond to that need? Next, bring what you've got. This was mentioned at the table over here regarding Love Inc. Finding out what your church actually has. Your church doesn't have to bring everything. One church has certain resources, another church has other resources. As we are talking, I remember in this situation with this homeless need that we were doing our project for, there was a church that had a giant building that they were like, hey, we got this giant building. It's like 200 years old, and our church has like 35 people in a giant church that's 200 years old. Can you use you can use our building, but we don't have the volunteers to staff a shelter in this building. Meanwhile, there were other churches who didn't have buildings for use, but they had all these young volunteers who wanted to help out. And so the work was telling each one, it's okay, bring what you have, not what you don't have. And so be thinking through this process as you're thinking about assets. What's the unique way that God has shaped our church, that God has gifted our church, that we can contribute to the larger body of Christ, that we can contribute to the larger community? What asset can we offer? My own church, as we're thinking through this homeless needs, we converted an old business building. It has a shower in it. I don't know if it was like the CEO had his own shower or something. And so we have a shower. So if people who are living in the Walmart parking lot need a place to come every week to just get a shower, have some dignity, or twice a week, like that's something we can offer. And so we just need to think through how can they get there. But these are examples of what assets do your church have? And again, I'm using the homeless example just because that's where some of these insights came. But I hope you're applying it to whatever the gap is in your region, in your county, in your neighborhood. Second, so we talked about the gaps. We've talked about the assets that we want to identify. Second, engage partners across sectors without duplication or burnout. First, engaging partners across sectors. If you're finding a gap and you're looking for assets and you're thinking, how should we respond? Maybe it's obvious, but first, look for who's already doing it. You might not be the first person to think about this need. And there may be other people there who would love to know that you care as much about this issue as they do. So one of the first practices you can do when you're seeking to engage partners to help you with this issue is say, as you're networking, hey, is there anyone else doing this sort of work? Because it just might be that God's leading you to be a support for somebody else or to collaborate with somebody else who's already doing it. Next, use different framing for different partners. This is what I mentioned earlier last session when I was talking about how we each speak our own language, like faith language, provider language, government language. And if I'm a provider and I go to a church and say, hey, I'm wondering if you could help me. I really want to help people with socialization and community integration. And I really just want to be provide good whole health care. Church might be like, yeah, that's fine, but it's not really what we're passionate about. And similarly, if you say as a church to an organization, hey, we're all about expanding the kingdom of God. Today, we want to make disciples of all nations in Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, and kind of you're our Judea. So we want to see if we could work together. They might be like, this is weird. What are you talking about? Even though if we were to be good missionaries and speak the language of the people we're trying to collaborate with, and we learn how they speak, we might be able to say, hey, actually, this can be a win-win. Our God calls us to care for those who are vulnerable, and I know you do a lot of work in being proximate with vulnerable people. I'm wondering if we could talk about how we could do some of that work together. We're doing the same thing. We're just trying to meet people where they are and frame things in ways they can understand. And when you're engaging people, engaging different churches, let's say, or organizations, it doesn't have to be the leader or at least the senior leader that you're working with. So many times, people have sought to engage partners and they call up a senior pastor who thinks, I can't do one thing more. I'm already behind on my sermon. I'm overseeing small groups. I have 4 hospitals to visit over the next 2 days. I can't take another community need. But if we say to that leader, hey, do you know anyone who's passionate about X? In this scenario with homelessness, there was a local church where we chose not to ask the senior leader to be involved. We just said, do you know anyone who cares about homelessness? And he said, yeah, I actually do. There's this woman in my church who cares about this. She came to our gatherings and she was a catalyst for her church being one of the primary shelters for people who were living outside because the pastor didn't feel like he had to do it and because we invited the pastor to name someone else. And so same thing for whatever organization or institution. It's tempting to say, may I speak with the head? But maybe it's helpful to just say, could I speak with someone in your church, in your organization, who's passionate about this? Love to just start a conversation. Or someone who knows somebody who might be. Now, what about engaging partners without duplication or burnout? Because these can be some challenges. Is we engage partners and we're just duplicating the work. We're just getting more of the same people involved. Or we get burnt out in the process and we have our kind of eyes are bigger than our stomach and we try to do these amazing community level things and we get exhausted and it can't be sustained and we give up. How do we avoid those? A couple ideas. First, as a deacon in our area told me, he was one of those people at those frequent Friday meetings, he said, fill the gap, don't overlap. So as you're looking for assets, as you're engaging partners, the question becomes, what is the gap that exists? And how do you fill that with people, getting people at the table who aren't at the table versus getting everyone at the table who does the same thing? All of us have certain people we know how to connect with because they're like us, because of our own work experience, but we need to tap into other people so that they can go into their own networks, so that your work is about both finding those gaps. That should be one of the first things you do when you talk about that first component in step one, the gaps and the assets. But not just finding them, but filling those gaps with the community partners, getting the people at the table who aren't at the table right now. I can tell you this, I'm really good at getting providers and faith people at the table. I'm not good at getting people from the business community at the table. So we need to identify people in our churches who are part of the business community who can get them at the table because they might have a voice for this community level issue that are really helpful to hear. And identify a backbone leader. For you, you might have the vision, but you might say to yourself, I don't know that I can be the leader of this initiative. I'm inspired to start up things. I'm a good starter. I'm kind of like an apostle in that way, but I'm not so good at maintaining it all. And that can burn you out and it can burn others out if everyone's overlapping each other, everyone's doing the same stuff. But if you can identify a backbone leader, someone who can see how everything is working, someone who can make sure these assets are complementary and working toward the common goal. We saw firsthand that when my colleague Mark did the work of a backbone leader, he could bring people together on Fridays. He could notice when certain people weren't able to have a voice and make sure they had a voice. After you get people together at a table, you need to identify who's going to be leading this, or at least do I have a couple people who can lead this community-wide initiative? So, what have we done so far? What we've done so far is we've tried to identify the gaps in our community so that we know, why are we doing this work? We've tried to say, what are the assets in our community that we can identify so that they can be part of responding to those gaps? Now we've tried to engage partners in this space. And as we engage partners, we're trying to do so in a way that's not just duplicating who we already have there. And we're trying to do it in a way that doesn't burn everybody out, but can have some clarity and leadership to the process. After that's occurred, step 3 is we want to take a clear, context-specific next step toward collaboration. So we want to actually start doing it. We don't want to get so involved in the planning process that we aren't engaged in the actual doing. You can lose people if you don't get to this doing and you spend all your time in the planning. But planning is necessary. One thing we found helpful is to call a town hall. We had a lot of virtual town halls where we just, among the people we had tapped, we didn't have to have everything worked out ahead of time, but we were able to say, this is the why, this is the concern. And then we had 4 virtual town halls. You can do them in person because some people are available certain days and nights, certain people aren't available those times. So by having a few different town halls, we cast our vision to people and we saw who were those people who went, oh, I thought I was interested, but I'm not actually. And the other people who went, oh, wow, I want to be a part of this. And this is what I'm bringing. So first, start convening people. Call a town hall. Second, tell stories, not just statistics. One of the things that really inspires people to do the work is when you tell stories of real people being impacted by the issue that is giving you a passion to respond to. We have people here who do peer support work, and having people with a lived experience at the table, people who've gone through the experience that you're trying to address, being able to speak to things is truly inspiring in addition to it being clarifying around what the real gaps are and what the real work to be done is. Statistics are valuable. I think it's really good. There are certain research-minded people. We're having the research being able to say to our community, hey, this is how many homeless people there were 2 years ago, and this is how many homeless people there are now. For some people, that was like, wow, that's what I needed to hear to know we needed to be involved. But for other people, it was simply hearing a story of someone saying, hey, I lost my housing back during that hurricane that we had, and now I've been living outside trying to keep my family together. And then people are just like, whoa, I had no clue. And they got involved. So how are you, when you're gathering people together, making sure you're telling those stories, not to manipulate people, but just to be clear with people around the significance of the issue that you're hoping they can respond to. And let the streets design your program, which is to say, you remember earlier I talked about staying proximate with people. So you're staying proximate to people who are really being impacted by it. So you know what are the true gaps. But you also want to let, as you start bringing people together, let the street design your program means it doesn't have to be all your ideas. Let the people who are on the ground, the people in the provider community, the people who are involved in church ministries, again, I said the people who are being impacted by it with a lived experience, let their ideas begin to shape what should be done, not just your grand vision ahead of time, which means this is an ongoing organic process. It's not just going to be a front end, we get it all sorted out, because curveballs are going to come that are going to cause you to go, oh, I thought this was the work to be done, but now I'm realizing this government regulation is rearing its head, so we can't do that thing. And now I'm realizing this partner actually doesn't want to let us use their building anymore, so we can't do that thing. We need to continually let this organic process be shaped by the people in the room who are most impacted and most involved. And build the plane as you fly it. Doesn't this sound comforting to you that I would end with build the plane as you fly it? It's just recognizing the reality that things change and that you're going to learn once you start getting into motion and once you start trying to respond, you're learning what works and what doesn't work along the way. And so this is to keep people from saying, oh, we're just stuck. We can't do it because of these barriers. Start responding with some of the tools and some of the approaches we've already named, but be flexible enough to recognize it's not going to look like the same initiative later that it was in the beginning, because it's addressing real people in real communities that are in flux. Now, I want to give you a couple of tools before we go to discussion that are kind of backbone leader tools. So if you're someone who you think, maybe I would be a leader of an initiative like that, or be part of a leadership team of an initiative like that, what do I need to be thinking about? I call these Mark's tools because he was the backbone leader of our initiative. And one of the things that Mark talked about was the hallmarks of community success. He said in his research, whenever you saw communities collaborating like this who were successful, there were 3 hallmarks. First, those communities were innovative. They did things that had not been done before, doing things that have not been done, doing new things in different ways. So the communities that were able to be involved were very creative. They were willing to think outside the box. Second, these communities were collaborative, working with people you've not worked with before or working with them differently. It wasn't just the same solutions. It was saying who's not at the table, who needs to be, who's not being collaborated with, that we could collaborate with. What new partnerships do we need to build to address this issue that have not been built? That's a staple, that's a hallmark of communities who have done this work well. And finally, decisional will. This is where you're deciding as a group that a thing needs to happen. It's the idea of when you're building that plane as you fly it and pieces start falling off the plane, you say, well, that really stinks, but we're still going to fly this thing. So who's good at fixing wings that have fallen off? It's just a commitment. If you've ever read the book Good to Great, any of you read that book? It was a really popular business book from years ago. And he called it he referred to one of the tools in it, he referred to as the Stockdale paradox. It was an Admiral Stockdale. And what the Stockdale paradox was, and I think, I could be wrong, so don't quote me. Unfortunately, this is being videoed, so I could be saying an untruth here. But as I remember it when I read it years ago, it was referring to some people who were able to survive when they were captured and others who didn't. And Admiral Stockdale combined two things that were paradoxical. On the one hand, he looked at a situation with complete reality. He didn't say, oh, maybe we'll be home by Christmas. Or maybe we'll home by summer. He was just like, we do not know when we're going to get home. But it's a combination of reality with a hopeful commitment. With a commitment that says, we are going to sort this out. We're going to figure it out. Ruthlessly honest and realistic, but also ruthlessly hopeful and committed to saying, we're going to figure it out. And I think that's part of decisional will here. Does your church, does your collaborative, does your organization have the decisional will to say, we are so committed to addressing this problem that we're going to be in it for the long term through all the twists and turns. So innovative, collaborative, and decisional will are hallmarks of these communities. And it can be a sort of North Star for you if you start taking part in one of these collaboratives. The second tool I just wanted to name was Mark's strategy for leading a community process. 3 steps that are just maybe kind of anchoring steps for you. Convene, align, and activate. And I won't read through all these different, everything he writes here. But notice this process of convening people, information gathering around, okay, what are the people that you've convened? What are the resources that they have? Who are they? Asset inventorying, where you're able to say, okay, these are the assets we have. These are the assets we don't have. Setting goals. Remember where we talked about like, what are we actually going to try to accomplish? And then the self-directed process, which is really that building you plane as you fly it, where you're recognizing this is a process over time that you're taking part in. And you're recognizing what's the next step? Who else do we need here? What structure supports sustainability? So again, if your church, if your organization wanted to be like, we want to walk through this over time, we have an 8-week process and a manual to help you do that. I've been flying over that during the time we had. So I recognize this might leave a lot of questions unanswered, but I hope today that this is just to inspire you and give you some places to start with this work. So what I want to do now is I want to take some time for discussion. Just looking at the clock here. Let's take 10 minutes. And these are the questions I want you to talk about at your table. I'll walk through these questions real quick. What is an issue or something you feel needs to be worked on in your church or community? What's something you feel like, wow, I'm passionate about that. I think there's a gap there that needs to be addressed. And I want to get involved in doing it collaboratively. How would you find out what's already being done about this issue? How would you find out if it's like, actually, there's other people doing work on this? Third, who do you need to collaborate with in order to make progress on this issue? Next, who in your space, whether church or organization, should be the champion of this initiative? Maybe it's the person getting things off the ground. Maybe it's a backbone leader. And last, what is the next step you need to take? I know Trent was talking about one of the real goals for today is that you're walking out of here with practical next steps, that you didn't just come and get information. It's not just information, it's formation. How are you thinking about yourself? What are these next steps I need to take in my context so that this information leads to action? So let's take 10 minutes to discuss at our tables.